The defense mechanism of the two is known as repression because the character has become so unaware of their own needs as they repress them in favor of helping and serving others. For the E2, repression stands as a defense to avoid becoming conscious of their own impulses. Repression allows the Enneagram 2 to selectively eliminate the aspects of their behavior that they do not want to see. It becomes difficult to draw the boundary between one knowing what they do and pretending not to know. It is difficult to distinguish the hysterical condition from malingering. Repression is an unconscious not wanting to know. The E2 gets caught up not only in the deception he feeds the world, but also himself. The E2 can compensate for this, however, through emotionalization of feelings. He facilitates the process of distracting awareness from need. In this type, it is not just emotionality that drives this character, but also interpersonal pushiness within relationships. They have an impatient need for satisfaction and a childlike inability to defer gratification. For the E2, satisfaction has to be immediate and extremely rewarding. E2s need to be aware of the satisfaction they receive. Unconscious satisfaction does nothing for this Enneagram type and leads to an insatiable thirst for intensity. The unawareness of his own need, specifically for love, is how pride manifests in this character. The foundation of pride comes from self-worth, the measure of worth that comes from the love they received within childhood. The E2 refuses to acknowledge their own want, as this means that they will have to admit their thirst for love isn't satiated, and they don't feel the love they believe they deserve. For the E2, it is dangerous to acknowledge their own wishes, as it can be seen as a characteristic excess, a giving to get, or a giving motivated by personal need to identify oneself with the role of a giver. In the proud and histrionic character, nothing is more avoided than the love thirst and the sense of unlovability that are characteristics of envy.
Sophie! You sabotaged me! Look what you've done to my hair! Look!
Oh, what a pretty color.
The Enneagram 3 uses identification as a defense mechanism to transform into what others expect him to be. They find identity through external validation. This often stems from the early life of the character, where their parents would place heavy expectations on them through wishes, values, and behaviors. Identification differs from introjection, as instead of the focus being on internalization and feeling different, the E3 will externally adopt the characteristics of another and is then transformed externally. The E3 typically tends to cling to identification from early in childhood based on expectations they had earlier on in life. However, in adulthood, they tend to evolve constantly, keeping up with the constructive image of what is socially desirable at the time. The E3 does what can be called market research to know what behavior and attributes are the most desirable at the time and do their best to replicate this. The bad self-image of the Type 4 is a direct expression of an introjected and self-rejecting parent, and that an envious neediness results from the chronic self-hate that is caused by this introject. A need for external approval and love, a need to compensate for the inability to love himself. Projection is a mechanism of envy. I think that the process through which in Type 4 familiarity breeds contempt is more like an infection, in virtue of which self-degeneration extends to those who through intimacy they have become bonded to. In this situation, the sense of self, which is never fixed, seems, in the more dependent personalities, to extend furthest into the world of intimate relationships. While self-hating or self-rejection is implicit in the notion of an introjected bad object, the thought that anger generated in consequence of frustration is not only aimed at the external source of frustration, but also at themselves. Introjection is a mechanism that makes it possible for the person to transform superiority into inferiority as he adopts the masochistic strategy in interpersonal relationships. It is as if the introject is a stone tied to the person's foot, making sure that they sink. The dynamic represented not only shows the repression of one emotion, anger, but its transformation into the next, envy.